So we pick up our story after Siddhartha's renunciation of everything that he's ever known, his sheltered palace life of luxury, and leaving his hometown Kapilavastu. At the river Anoma, he shaves his head and swaps his princely clothes for a beggar's robe and set out on a quest for enlightenment, for answers to his questions. Siddhartha begins his journey by seeking out some renowned teachers, including masters like Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. They taught him about many different religious philosophies, theologies, practices, and rituals. They also taught him meditation methods by which he could calm his mind and enter a series of more and more refined states of peace and serenity, so that Siddhartha's awareness of the outside world and all of his troubles would fade away. Although these experiences were very powerful for him and satisfying in themselves, Siddhartha found that they did not last. Once his meditation was finished, he returned to just how he was before. Siddhartha wanted a permanent solution. So, frustrated, Siddhartha and 5 disciples left to find enlightenment on their own. They relocated to a spot near a pleasant village in the far west of Magadha, where he took up a completely different course of action. These 6 companions attempted to find their freedom from suffering through extreme physical discipline, which involved things like enduring pain, holding their breath, and fasting nearly to the point of starvation. It was another common approach used by many religious people in Siddhartha's day, called asceticism, which is the testing of the physical body through arduous and difficult tasks. Like I said, these included things like exposure to the heat of the sun without protection, avoiding a single physical posture, such as lying or sitting down, holding your breath, and fasting by reducing your food intake progressively, just a little bit at a time, so that you could survive on very tiny amounts of food. The idea was that you could wear down the physical influence of your body and your mind and release the soul, an invisible immaterial essence within every individual. Siddhartha took up this type of practice wholehearted and was very good at living the life of an ascetic, of a mendicant monk. But after years of trying a variety of different practices, Siddhartha collapsed. He decided that everything that he was doing was risking his health and death without any real solution to the problems of suffering and ignorance. The strict regime of a mendicant monk left Siddhartha feeling very unsatisfied. And it occurred to him that while he'd renounced all of these pleasures and left behind that palace life, he'd given up, if you like, the pursuit of things that made him feel happy on the outside. He'd turned and grasped the opposite of pleasure, pain. And instead of living a life of self-indulgence, he now lived a life of self-denial. He'd simply swapped one extreme for the other, one kind of suffering and ignorance for another. So Siddhartha began to consider a middle way between these 2 extremes. He remembered an experience from his childhood, a time when his mind had settled into a state of deep peace, and it dawned on him that the path of freedom, of liberation, the way to be free of all of his suffering and ignorance, was through discipline of the mind rather than discipline of the body. He realized that instead of starving himself, he needed to feed himself because he needed nourishment to build up his strength for the effort that it would take to train his mind. So he accepted as his first meal a bowl of rice milk from a young girl called Sujata, which she gave to Siddhartha as a way of saying thank you for having just given birth to a baby boy that she had been desperate for a long time. His 5 companions thought, Siddhartha's given up the quest, and they abandoned him. Alone now, Siddhartha continued to search for enlightenment with a newfound resolve and determination. He sat meditating beneath a sacred fig tree, Ficus religiosa, known ever after this story as the Bodhi tree, Bodhi meaning awakening. And that's where we get the word Buddha and Buddhism from. Near the river Neranjara, he sought a way to understand the human condition, which we spoke about in our last lesson. He combined restraint with the withdrawal from the senses that he'd learned in meditation, and remembering that moment of quiet illumination from his childhood, he entered into a state of mind in which he could recall all of his past lives and understand what kept him and others like you and I to this endless cycle of rebirth, which both Hindus and Buddhists refer to as samsara. There he attained his awakening, or bodhi. And this was the core experience by which he became to be called the Buddha, which means awakened one. Legend has it that after his meal, Siddhartha placed the empty tray on a river that he was sitting next by, that river Niranjara. And normally, of course, the tray would have flown along the river's current. This time, however, the tray seemed to flow against the current, and Siddhartha, taking this as a sign, knew that the time for his awakening had come. During his meditation, Siddhartha was tempted, however, by Mara, this demon spirit that we looked at in our notes from our last lesson, the personification of evil in Buddhist mythology. Mara represents temptation, sin, death, and evil, and is closely linked with Namuche, one of the wicked demons in Hinduism or Indian mythology, which of course is where, in essence, Buddhism was born. For more on this idea of a Buddhist devil, Mara, and the Hindu demon spirit Namuche, you can click on the link just at the bottom of your screen there. Whether or not Mara is a real entity depends on, of course, which Buddhist tradition you come from. And we'll spend more time later on in examining the various communities and traditions within Buddhism, but for now, it's enough to say that there are two major schools of thought. Theravada Buddhism, which is a Pali word, meaning teachings of the elders. And that branch of Buddhism can be found in places like Sri Lanka and Southeast Asia. And then there is Mahayana Buddhism, which is a Sanskrit word, meaning the greater vehicle. And in fact, the Pali language is most often associated with Theravada tradition and Sanskrit with the Mahayana tradition. So Mahayana Buddhism, another major school of Buddhism that includes Tibetan and Zen Buddhism, and you might be more familiar with those words. Mahayana Buddhists strive to become, unlike Theravada Buddhists, they strive to become a bodhisattva, which is a word meaning someone who wants to become enlightened. They are on the path, but who has also made a conscious, willful decision to be reborn in the cycle of rebirth, and so help others to achieve enlightenment. Many Tibetan Buddhists will tell you that rather than thinking of these traditions as separate, we really should think of them as complementing each other, adding or building to one another. Each tradition a necessary part of Buddhist belief and practice. The teaching of the elders becomes the greater vehicle, and then Tibetan Buddhism, which takes it another step forward. Now, some will criticize that view as being particularly oversimplistic and maybe even perhaps a little manufactured to give the appearance of more unity in the tradition than there actually exists. Different traditions, of course, have interpreted the work of Siddhartha's meditation, the training of his mind under the Bodhi tree, in different ways. For some, it's been mythologized, as we've said, as this great battle with the demon spirit Mara. Theravada Buddhists, for example, interpret these events literally. Mara is a real demon, and they believe that spirits like Mara should be kept happy, appeased. Other Buddhists interpret Siddhartha's battle entirely figuratively. Siddhartha's struggles are symbolic of the obstacles that he and you have to overcome in order to reach the truth. And so, on the night before his enlightenment, the demon Mara comes to tempt Siddhartha with riches and power. He brought with him thoughts of universal power, absolute rule, and wealth beyond imagination, in which to tempt Siddhartha with. And when that failed, Mara brought, so the story goes, vast armies of monsters to attack Siddhartha. But all through this, the former prince sits still, untouched, unharmed, unfazed by all of these attacks. Then Mara sends his 3 beautiful daughters in an effort to seduce Siddhartha. First, Mara's daughter Tana, which means desire or craving, which you might remember from your look at the Four Noble Truths. Then Raga, meaning lust, and Arati, which means aversion or hatred. Finally, after Mara's demon daughters had failed in their attempts, he claimed that the seat of enlightenment rightfully belonged to him and not to Siddhartha. Mara's spiritual accomplishments were greater than Siddhartha's, the demon says. And Mara's monstrous soldiers, the horde behind him, cry out together, "I am his witness." Mara then challenged Siddhartha, "Who's going to speak for you?" Then Siddhartha, so the story goes, reaches out his hand in front of him to touch the ground, and the earth itself roars back, "I bear you witness." At this, Mara flees, disappears. As the morning star rises in the sky the next morning, Siddhartha Gautama realizes his enlightenment and becomes the Buddha, or a Buddha, the awakened one. He understood now all the answers to the questions that had been plaguing his mind for such a long time. And it was this wisdom that he was determined to pass on to everyone else. In the Dhammapada, in the teachings of the Buddha, verses 153 and 154, we read this: "Through many a birth in samsara have I wandered in vain, seeking the builder of this house of life. Repeated birth is indeed suffering. O house builder, you are seen. You will not build this house again, for your rafters are broken and your ridgepole shattered. My mind has reached the unconditioned. I have attained the destruction of craving." These verses, I think, perfectly sum up Siddhartha's moment of enlightenment. Samsara is the word given to this endless cycle of rebirth. And in Buddhist philosophy, we are all trapped in samsara, continually being reborn. We'll spend much more time on samsara later, but in these particular verses of the Buddhist teachings, we get the sense that samsara itself is nothing but suffering. As you've already seen from your introduction to the Four Noble Truths, all life is suffering in Buddhist philosophy. The first noble truth, dukkha, refers to this unsatisfactoriness that exists in every aspect of life, good or bad, happy or sad. So to be continually reborn is to be continually sentenced, if you like, to suffering. In enlightenment, which lay at the end of a path paved with meditation and discipline of the mind, Siddhartha had found his freedom from rebirth. And at the same time, Siddhartha had found victory over all of the cravings and the desires that keep us bound to the cycle of rebirth. The second noble truth, Tana. Thanks so much for spending time to watch our lesson today. There's a really useful timeline on BBC Bitesize, again the link at the bottom of your screen, which will also give you some highlights of our next lesson, beginning with the Buddha's first sermon at Deer Park. That first turning of the wheel that you've already been introduced to in your last set of notes. Don't forget, watch the video a couple of times if you need to, take notes, screenshot those notes or type them up and email them to me as part of this week's work.